Welcome back, viewers, to the second part of our emphasis for PTSD Awareness Month, the month of June. So today is June 30th, the last day of the month, and our final opportunity to help us be aware and have knowledge about PTSD. So back with us today again is Counselor Lori Coates.
Hi.
Did a great job last week helping us answer some initial questions. So we're going to pick up where we left off from talking about symptoms, and we're going to finish a PowerPoint that we began last week. So let me go ahead and just bring that up and get us started on that for today. Again, this is a PowerPoint that we're using from the Veterans Health Administration and the National Center for PTSD. They know what they're doing, and they help us be able to share this information with you today. So last week we talked about these first three questions you see on this slide about what is traumatic stress and how common it is and what symptoms are. So we're going to pick up there with the fourth question: why do some people develop PTSD and others don't? Then what problems co-occur with PTSD, and then how we go about treating it with psychotherapy and medications. So as we are looking at that initial question, why do some people get PTSD and others, we're going to break this down in three sections. One has to do with personal factors involving that person, then the traumatic event itself, and then the recovery environment. So Lori, let's first talk about the personal factors that are listed here. It's 3 bullet points there that are important.
Genetics plays a big part in whether or not a person would develop PTSD over another person. Depending on how your genetic makeup is that, you might have the genetic makeup to make PTSD a much higher factor than someone who doesn't have that genetic makeup.
Wow.
The other thing is historical factors, basically, how much, if you've been exposed to trauma in the past and then you're re-exposed as opposed to someone who's never been exposed to trauma in the past and then gets exposed. So that could play a big factor in whether or not you develop PTSD from a traumatic event. And then, of course, demographics, we saw last week in the slide that, men to women, 60% men to 50% women experience a traumatic event. But when we looked at who developed PTSD from it, it was much more likely women had a much higher, risk of it.
Yeah.
And again, I believe that comes from the fact that women are very emotional people. Being a woman, you have to be very emotional to handle children. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So
it's part of it.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's one of the reasons why women become. So if you are a woman and you are a very emotional person, then and you experience a traumatic event, you're more likely to develop PTSD than say someone who's not.
As you were just saying that, I was thinking about maybe a person who had a traumatic event as a child that, for whatever reason, it didn't get addressed.
Right.
But then they have a traumatic event as an adult. That's an example of history.
Exactly.
On top of,
right. Yes.
Right.
So let's say a person, we'll go back because this is what I see a lot of cases from a person who they were sexually assaulted as a child and then they get sexually assaulted as an adult. So they're more likely to develop PTSD after the second event than they were from the first one, because the first one did not get addressed. Right. They did not get treatment.
Yeah. So it makes sense. The symptoms we talked about last week would be very easy for them to get in the routine.
Absolutely. And the new event could trigger flashbacks of the previous event.
Yeah.
So they, that would, again, would make them more susceptible to PTSD than it would not.
Which, oh man, it just makes me want to shout from the rooftops that as soon as possible, when someone experiences trauma, it doesn't matter how old they are, that getting into seeing someone is so
Absolutely.
important.
Absolutely. The other thing is minority and ethnicity.
Hmm.
Um, some cultures, you don't talk about things that happen.
Right.
So when they happen, it's just hush hush.
Hmm.
You just don't talk about them. That's a reality in some cultures.
Right.
The other thing with minorities is inner city kids will typically, and that's a minority, but inner city kids will typically have more
Correct.
chances of PTSD than than a rural kid who grew up in the suburbs or a rural area, because as we know, the violence in inner city are usually much greater, so they're going to be more likely to experience not just trauma as children, but also trauma as adults or repeated trauma.
Mhm.
So that will make them much higher risk for
And
PTSD.
yeah, and maybe a couple of slides might get into this, but it may not necessarily be personal trauma. It could be community trauma as well,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
So let's move to the next example of this, the traumatic event itself. And there's two thoughts here about that. Help us with that. The unintentional and deliberate.
Unintentional is things like um, hurricanes, tornadoes. They weren't intended to happen. Intentionals are more things like war, um, inner city crimes,
Mhm.
things like that. That would be those were intentionally thought out and um, acted upon.
Mhm.
So unintentional, or there are things again, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, things that were not intended to happen. Um, you know, uh, for an example would be the California wildfires.
Oh, yes.
That would be an unintentional traumatic
Mhm.
event. You're living out there, wildfires spread, it burns down your house and everything in it. You may be safe, but you've lost
Sure.
everything. You've lost your lifelong,
Yeah.
whatever you have.
Mhm.
That would be an unintentional. Intentional again would be things like war, inner city crimes, things in more recent news, things like what happened in Minneapolis with Floyd's death.
Right. Right.
That would be an intentional.
Mhm.
There was a lot of trauma built around that.
Correct.
And the things that happen afterwards.
Mhm.
So every time we see these events happening on the news, somebody's life is being impacted, and it's a trauma for someone.
Man, that's a good awareness right there, just for our own personal reaction to what we see.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, so much good stuff. All right, then the recovery environment. This is leading us to how do we go about recovery. So speak to this for a moment.
So the recovery environment again is things like if you have low social support, in other words, you don't have those loved ones around you that can help support you. That can impact whether or not you develop PTSD or not. So if you've got a traumatic event happens, you have a good loving support system, you're less likely to develop PTSD as opposed to developing PTSD because you have that support system.
Mhm.
Those who do not have that support system will be most likely to want the ones to develop PTSD.
Which makes a good understanding of why veterans might be more susceptible. Is that accurate?
Absolutely,
Mhm.
because and you take the Vietnam War, for example. A lot of veterans from that era, when they came home much unlike our veterans today that go to war. They came home and sometimes not even their families wanted them.
Right.
Because they may have been missing a limb or, whatever their injury was. But a lot of times even their own families didn't want any more to do with them.
Yeah.
So yes, And then in today's, our wars today, they're just, no war is a good war, but the wars today that we fight as opposed to Vietnam was a better war than the wars we fight today, just because of the technology that's out there today in weaponry. So, and the other thing is when in the Vietnam War, a lot of those guys went either by themselves or, but nowadays the military is sending whole troops, whole units over. So a whole unit will deploy overseas as opposed to just, you might have one or two out of this unit or one or two out of that unit for the Vietnam War, but today it's whole units are being deployed.
Right.
So you're watching literally, people that you're working with every day in the States, you go to war, you're watching them get killed.
Yeah.
So that's why PTSD is so much more today than it was even back, in the Vietnam era.
So let's talk about the other things that come along with it. We touched on this a little bit last week, but there's more to talk about. Interesting statistic here: 80% have one or more other mental health diagnoses.
Yes, we call those co-occurring events, co-occurring or comorbid, co-occurring. For example, they may have PTSD and substance abuse. So that's usually the two co-occurring things that we see.
Okay.
With any co-occurring is that you'll have substance abuse and some other mental health diagnoses. So we see substance abuse a lot with PTSD because what do substances do? They
numb you.
Yeah, they numb
Right.
you. Alcohol is a depressant. So when we don't want to think about what's going on in our head, we drink alcohol, we get drunk, and it goes away. We think.
Right.
Pills the same way. Someone who might not be addicted to pills suffers a traumatic event, and now they are addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
And a little bit of that we'll get into in one of the other slides as we go forward when we talk about medications.
Right. Okay. So the co-occurrence is common. And on this next slide, we see some other examples of that, of other co-occurring problems. And all of these are, I'm sure you've seen all of these with clients.
Yes. Reduced quality of life, that just means that, your life is different than what it was before. You have a lower quality of life. You're not interested in the same things you used to do. Post-trauma, you lose complete interest in the things you used to do.
Yeah.
Say if you like to ride bikes, then you're more likely not to want to do that activity post-trauma.
Right. And so left unaddressed, then you could see why that one to the would be the right of the figure, the increased risk of suicide attempts.
Yes, and we see a lot of that with veterans today. They just can't deal with what's going on in their head, and they feel like that their only solution is suicide. And our veterans today, the suicide risk is higher today with veterans, I think, than it ever has been.
Mm-hmm. And just to reiterate, PTSD is not just for veterans. So anyone that has it, you want to encourage them to move toward treatment to avoid getting to that space.
Absolutely.
Right. So let's talk about treatment now. On this slide, we see the importance and encouragement that actually trauma-focused psychotherapy is the best treatment. Why do we say that?
Well, trauma-focused therapy focuses on, you focus on the trauma, but you also look at the things that the other symptoms that happens with PTSD, such as depression and anxiety. So getting treatment is going to be very important as soon as you can after the trauma happens, in order not to develop PTSD, because psychotherapy is going to look totally different if you develop PTSD from a trauma as opposed if you don't. So the
Sure.
sooner you get treatment after a trauma, the less chances you're going to have to get PTSD.
Yeah, and I love how this is worded, that 53 out of 100 people who have received trauma-focused therapy will no longer have PTSD after about 3 months.
Yes.
That's hopeful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But again, it goes back to making sure you get the treatment as soon after trauma as possible.
Yeah. So regarding medication, it says 42%, same thing. So it's pretty close. What's the idea between working those together?
The idea of working those together is medication will treat the symptoms of PTSD. It's not going to treat the PTSD. If you get an infection and you go to the doctor's going to treat the infection. They're going to give you an antibiotic to treat the infection. But and that works. We're going to do psychotherapy to treat the PTSD. Okay, the medication is going to get you to a point to where you can work through the trauma.
Okay.
Because if we have a person who, say, on a scale of 0 to 10 is depressed and anxious, and say they're at a 10, okay, trying psychotherapy at that point, it's just not going to work. So we have to actually get them down, their number lower, so that they can start working through the trauma. Because trying to get them to work through the trauma is going to be much harder if you are not able to focus.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit. You touched on this as far as the need for psychotherapy. There's different types, of course, and we'll get into these. This slide talks about the cognitive, emotional, behavioral techniques. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide and look at some examples of these types of psychotherapies. Prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I'm sure for most of us this is a new language, so help us with this.
So PE, or prolonged exposure, that's where you as a therapist expose the person to the trauma.
Okay.
So basically they relive it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
In a safe environment.
Right.
Okay. So that if they start to have symptoms, then you can quickly, as a therapist, be able to step in and stop the treatment at that point.
Okay.
So that's what basically is what that is.
Okay.
Cognitive processing therapy is where you use cognitive behavior therapy techniques such as thought process restructuring.
Okay.
So you help them restructure the thought process.
That's good.
So that's where that would come in, as you challenge irrational thoughts. I use a technique called putting your thoughts on trial, where you actually look at an irrational thought and present evidence that it's a rational thought. So you have to actually think like a lawyer. You have to actually put your thoughts on trial. So I use a worksheet like that.
Okay.
So that would be one. EMDR, I don't use EMDR because I'm not trained in it yet, but it is where you sometimes can use a light. A lot of therapists will use a light. It's a long light, and they use the light to kind of help desensitize your eyes.
Okay.
And again, I don't use EMDR, so I'm not really well versed in the process of it. But it's very effective for trauma.
Yes.
It is apps usually the main go-to
Okay.
um, of trauma therapy.
So you bring up a good point that if someone is seeking therapy treatment, to find the counselor and maybe even explore, and correct me if I'm wrong, but explore different types of therapies that are best going to work for the client. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. EMDR goes, it can be used if you're looking for something that's going to happen quickly.
Okay.
Okay, because you're going to have a much faster results with EMDR as you are with cognitive processing or prolonged
Okay.
exposure.
Great. So is it fair to say these are the three most common and most
They're
helpful?
the most common.
Okay.
I have some others that I use.
Mhm.
You know, trauma resolution therapy is
Okay.
another one where we have the person, the clinician will have the person write about the trauma. So
Okay.
things like that. So,
And it sounds like maybe these on the next slide here, narrative exposure trauma and written narrative exposure.
yes, and
Those are
that's
helpful.
what trauma resolution therapy
Okay.
is. It's a narrative.
Mm-hmm. So these are just some other examples. Viewers, you can look at these and explore these online as you're thinking about different therapy types that you either are personally might be in need of, or one that you could share with someone else. And of course, as you're talking with therapists, find out what kind of therapies they use.
Right.
So those are thoughts about therapy. Now, some brief thoughts here about medications. On this slide, it talks about first line medications. What can you tell us about these?
The first one is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. It's a mouthful.
Yes.
We call them SSRIs. Those are your best ones
Okay.
to do.
Why?
Because they and I could get into the whole brain thing, but we'll keep it very simple here.
Thank you.
Your brain makes certain what we call mood balancing treatments, and when things happen, sometimes our brain can't make enough fast enough to be able to help us. So things like for depression, so then we use things like Paxil, Zoloft, Prozac.
Okay.
And again, they're SSRIs. So for one, they're non-habit forming, which is a big thing, especially if we've got a substance abuser. We don't want to give that substance abuser something that's going to be habit forming.
Okay.
And again, the second one is Effexor. That is it has the neuronephrine.
Okay.
I can never say that word right. But it has an added component as the SSRIs.
Okay.
So it's the SSRIs with an added component.
Okay. So these are medications, if necessary. Well, like you said, if someone comes in and they're so high,
they're so depressed that they or anxious that they can't, really be able to. You can't effectively walk them through treatment. Then yes, we would recommend that they see a psychiatrist and get on something to help elevate their mood before we start. Because if we try to treat them before that, it's going to add more trauma for them.
Right.
So
So some warnings actually about other types of medications. Why would we say these are warnings?
We want to stay away from any kind of what we call bins, like your Xanax, your Valiums. These are the ones that are habit forming.
Okay.
So again, because substance abuse or misuse is so prevalent with people who suffer from PTSD or who have had a trauma, we want to try to stay away from these at all possible.
Okay, good to know. Key thing is get in treatment, and when and if necessary, use medications that are the right ones.
Yes.
And work with your therapist.
Absolutely.
And your doctors on those things. Well, we want to wrap up today by talking about resources that are available to you and pointing us back to the National Center for PTSD, this where we got this PowerPoint from. When you look at their website, you can see all kinds of really good resources for you, in this case, particularly for veterans, but trauma survivors, family members of them, to increase your own awareness and engage in treatment. If you don't have yet a connection with a counselor, or you're still a little skittish about that, you can look at their website and get some ideas that I think could actually ease you into, okay, I want to make that next step.
Right.
I think. So one way to do that, which is awesome that we live in the day and time in which we live,
Technology, right?
is having mobile apps. I would have never thought about this, but you mentioned some before we started recording.
I use because anxiety and depression is so big with PTSD and trauma. I actually use some mobile apps with my clients that allow them to do things like guided meditations, or some of the other things that we use in mindfulness. Grounding. Grounding is a mindful tool that we use. They become anxious, they become depressed, they can do some grounding, like, for example, putting your heels or your feet on the floor and pressing hard into the floor, and then just keep repeating that.
Yeah.
You press, you let go, you press. But other things like, ACT has a great site for a mobile site. So any of the mobile sites I've found have been useful with my clients.
That's awesome. It's almost like a 24/7 therapist with you. Not
Well,
quite the same, obviously.
Exactly. But I tell my clients all the time that 90% of therapy happens outside of
But
session.
there you go.
We have 45 minutes to an hour
Right.
with you. And, so if you're not doing something to foster that outside of session, it's going to take much longer to get you where you want to be.
Yeah. So these are great tools to have, these apps, and of course some online things again at the National Center for PTSD that they have a coach online, they call it, and then Bet Change can help those who certainly are using their services through the Veterans Health Administration. So all of these tools are available to you. Certainly we would encourage you to reach out to Samaritan if you have yet to connect, or someone, as you've watched these last 2 episodes and you're like, wow, we learned a lot, and I think I actually know someone or myself could use some help, then certainly call us. Beyond these resources we just mentioned, when you're ready, call us at Samaritan. Our phone number is there on the screen. You can look us up online at our website, Samaritan Gulf Coast. Of course, you're watching us on Facebook, so you can keep up with us there as well. But certainly reach out to us, and we have Lori and several other counselors who can help you work through these symptoms and get you to being healthy and whole. And even if you're, like we mentioned in our part 1, if you're dealing with this dealing with this for a lifetime, certainly getting the right connection and help alongside you is going to give you a better life.
Absolutely.
Any closing thoughts for us today?
Nope, just, it's been great to be here, and I'm glad I could help.
Thank you
You're
very
welcome.
much. Thank you for tuning in. And this is the end of our 2 episode for PTSD Awareness Month. We'll be back next month with some other content. But for the rest of this day, we hope your day works great. Have a good afternoon.